a few German words. We'll try not to get like too entangled, not to create many complications with this. But because there's controversy with the translations, and these are like central terms in Freud's theory, that Lacan talks a lot about these terms. So I think it's better that we are a little bit familiar with them. So first we have Verdrängung, which is a central technical term in Freud's theory, and is the famous repression that we all neurotics have, right? Like this is the basic mechanism which our superego and our ego use to be able not to think about these things that are too uncomfortable for our ego. That's the first term, Verdrängung, right? Very central term in Freud's system. Then there is another one that sometimes has been translated also as negation, which is Verleumdung, which the agreement in English is to translate it as disavowal. What's the idea here? The idea is that, for example, in the development of perversion, the child, for example, sees, the typical example given by Freud would be the child sees his mother naked, and so he realizes that she doesn't have a penis, she's castrated, and at the same time that he's acknowledging this, he's rejecting this thought, he's disavowing this thought. And so this is the mechanism of perversion, in which you accept something, but at the same time you're negating it. You're not acknowledging it, right? So, for example, in fetishism, Freud says the fetish is there as a substitution for the absent penis. So it's in a way both a recognition that the penis is not there or the phallus is not there, and at the same time a way of making it present. And we've been talking about Verwerfung, this in our last meetings, which is this third mechanism. The three mechanisms have things in common. They are all of them about rejecting something, right? Through repression, through disavowal, or through this most basic and radical mechanism. There's been a lot of controversy about how to translate this to English. And now the agreement is to translate it as foreclosure. It may be more like everyday terms is something like refusal or repudiation. And the idea is that the content that cannot be processed, cannot be assimilated by the mind of the subject is rejected from the beginning. It's not included, it's foreclosed in this sense, right? There's no inscription, there's no symbolic inscription of this. And so when we were discussing about the Wolfman in our last meetings, Freud uses this term, Verwerfung. This is not a technical term in Freud's system. It doesn't have the same status as Verdrängung or Verleumdung have, which are technical terms. Verwerfung is just a word that appears in Freud's texts, and Lacan identifies this and says, this is, it's interesting that Freud is not using Verdrängung here, is using a different word. And so Lacan builds a lot on Freud's use of Verwerfung. Then there is this 1925 article by Freud that Lacan takes up in Seminar 1, which is Verneinung, and that translates as negation. So all four terms have in common this idea of negating or excluding or rejecting something, and all of them, the four of them, have this prefix ver, which has different meanings in German, depending on the context, depending on the word. But I think, and my knowledge of German is very basic, it adds some kind of movement, of dynamism to this word. So, for example, negation is not just a logical negation. It's not something static. There is action. There is a speech act of actively denegating something. It has different meanings, the ver, depending on the word, but it usually conveys this element of movement and dynamism and activity. Something is being done in all four cases. This year in the seminar, in Lacan's seminar, he's talking about Freud's technical writings, and he says, were working on this period between 1904 and then 1912, but actually he goes back to the very beginnings, the studies on hysteria, which are from 1895 until the end. We were talking about Freud's article on constructions on psychoanalysis, which is 1937, and now he's talking about the article on negation that is from 1925. But all these articles share something. They're all very short, very much to the point, and they all refer to some linguistic maneuver that happens, some linguistic event that happens in the analysis and the options that the analyst has to intervene. And this will be very clear in this case. So Freud starts this very short article with very concrete and clear examples, right? For example, a patient is free associating, and then he comes to a point where he or she says to the analyst, "Now you'll think I mean to say something insulting, but I really have no such intention." So we can relate this to what we were talking about last couple of Saturdays, about how when the patient involves the person of the analyst, resistance is at stake. Resistance is happening. Now, there is resistance here because the patient had the thought of something, but he's reluctant to talk about this. And to excuse himself, of course, he invokes the analyst. He says, "Oh, I wouldn't say this because maybe you think it's insulting." What is Freud's conclusion? Yes, he means to say something insulting. What he is negating, that is exactly what is happening. You need to subtract the no and just keep the content. The content is important. The insult is important, right? So the client, the patient, had an idea and he is uncomfortable with this idea. So he wants to reject this idea. And the best way to reject it is to project to the figure of the analyst and say, "You will find this insulting, not me," right? So projects this emotion towards the figure of the analyst. Another example Freud gives is a patient who says, "You ask who this person in the dream can be. It's not my mother." So Freud says, you can be sure this figure in the dream represents the patient's mother, right? Otherwise, why would he make the point that this person is not his mother? It is, Freud says, as if the patient thought, "It's true that my mother came into my mind as I thought of this person, but I don't feel inclined to let that association count," right? So as an analyst, the technique here is to disregard negation and pick out the subject matter. Another example, the patient says, "I got a new obsessive idea and it occurred to me at once that it might mean so and so." So the patient is providing the interpretation for this obsessive idea. But no, this can't be true, right? And Freud always says, the first association, when, for example, also you're working with a dream and the patient has like several associations, but usually the first one is the most valuable. What he's repudiating is the correct meaning of the obsessive idea. The patient is providing himself the interpretation of the obsessive idea. So something interesting happens here because in Verdrängung, in repression, you cannot access the content. For example, there is some memory from childhood that you were with your nanny and such happened. Maybe there was some sexually confusing situation, and this memory is repressed. You cannot access it. But in this case, that's Verdrängung, right? That's repression. But in this case, the case of negation, the content can be accessed. The idea makes its way into consciousness on condition that it is negated. So it's like the subject is not owning this idea, right? Is not acknowledging the idea. He's distancing him or herself from this idea by way of negation. So it's a compromise solution. You are taking cognizance of the idea, and at the same time, you keep the effect of repression. It's not integrated into your network of associations. It still keep there, isolated, as if it were repressed. It is a lifting of the repression, though not an acceptance of what is repressed. Okay, so now he starts talking about judgment. Right? And he distinguishes, Freud, between two kinds of judgment. And this here, Freud is pretty much summarizing for us what philosophy and logic says about judgment. In logic, when we talk about judgment, we distinguish between two types of judgments. So, judgments are a type of thoughts in which we can do one of two things. One is we can issue a predicative judgment. A predicative judgment is when we assign a property to a subject. So, something, a person, or a thing possesses or does not possess a particular attribute. If I say, George is disgusting, or Melinda is smart, or Peter is tall, or Laura is blonde, we are relating an attribute to a subject matter, to a thing or a person. We can also say, this day is very cold, or this table is very old. So in all these cases, there is a judgment in which we are relating a thing to an attribute. And that's called a predicative judgment. We're predicating something of something. The other kind of judgment is what we call an existential judgment, where we simply say that something either exists or does not exist. Existential judgments assert or dispute that a presentation, and actually I would say here a representation, has an existence in reality. So whether something that you are representing in your mind actually exists in reality or not. So you imagine a unicorn, but you can say this doesn't exist in reality. Or you can say, I was thinking about the King of France. And someone can tell you, well, actually, France is not a monarchy. They don't have a king. So this doesn't exist in reality. Or I can say, for example, where is my coffee? And someone can tell me, no, actually, I didn't make coffee for you today. So it's an existential judgment in the sense that the coffee doesn't exist. The cup of coffee doesn't exist. Freud says that when we hear in free association a negative judgment, this is playing the same role as repression. He says, the no is the hallmark of repression, a certificate of origin. He says it's like when you get those labels that say made in Germany, today would be made in China, maybe. A certificate of origin. If you hear a no, this is coming from a repressive tendency in the patient. So let's go a little bit deeper with predicative judgments, judgments in which we assign a property to a thing. Now, the attribute might be good or bad, useful or harmful. So Freud says, if we're talking about oral drives, the judgment is, I want to eat this, or I want to spit it out. And Freud doesn't say this, but this is a little bit a theory that I have. When you are feeding a baby, have you noticed, like, let's think like a 4-month-old, a 6-month-old, just starting to eat like from the spoon, and you approach the spoon to the mouth. Sometimes they will open the mouth, right, and swallow the food, accept it. When they reject it, they will close their lips like this. And sometimes they already do this movement. So the first no that we witness in the child's history, the first no is a rejection of food. They don't want that food to enter their body. And so they close their lips and they do this gesture that, as far as I know, is universal. You know that gestures vary a lot across cultures. They're conventional. They depend on culture. But in most cultures, as far as I know, I checked this some time ago, that almost for every culture, this means no. Where does it come from? Most likely, I think, comes from this basic act of feeding a baby and the baby rejecting the food. And this is a first form of judgment. I don't want this. I don't want this in my body. I don't want this to be a property of me. And this is exactly, Freud doesn't make the connection with the gesture, but this is exactly what he's saying here. He's saying that in the language of oral drives, the predicative judgment is, I want to eat this, or I want to spit it out. More generally, I want to take this into myself, or I want to keep that out. It shall be inside me, or it shall be outside me. So he says this corresponds to a moment in the development of the ego where The ego is pretty much regulated by the pleasure principle. Everything that is good, I want it to be part of my ego. Everything that is bad, I want to expel it from my ego. And what is bad, what is alien to the ego, and what is external are identical. So what I don't like, what I don't want to be part of myself has to be outside. And what I like, what I think that is good and pleasurable, I want to swallow, I want to incorporate, I want it to be part of myself. And Freud says this is the affective, developmental origin of predicative judgments. Predicative judgments come from here. By the way, Freud doesn't quote Aristotle, but Aristotle has one of the first treatises in psychology in the whole history of Western thought, which is called On the Soul, Pedis Psyche. And he says that we have humans, right, have a sensitive soul that feels pleasure or pain depending on the stimuli. And also we have an animal soul that tries to approach whatever causes pleasure, whatever causes pleasure, and this is desire, and tries to avoid whatever causes pain or displeasure. And this is called aversion. And he also derives intellectual judgment from these two basic movements. So I don't know if Freud is basing himself in Aristotle at this point, but I think that there is like another formulation of this idea was already present in Aristotle. Let's go to the second type of judgment, and this is the existential judgment. So Freud makes the predicative judgment like the more primitive, the more original, and the existential judgment comes second. And there is an issue with translation. The word that Freud is using is Vorstellung, which it's more commonly translated into English as representation. The idea is you perceive something and that has left a mark in your mind, and this mark, the memory of what happened, is Freud calls this Vorstellung. For some reason, I think that to avoid some kind of philosophical problem with the word representation, the English translators of Freud use presentation for this, which I think is very stupid. How can you translate this mark that is left in your mind, the memory, as presentation? It's a representation. It's a memory of what happened. So this is why I'm putting in parentheses the re here. Whether something, because in the original, in the English version that you read, is presentation. Whether something which is in the ego as a presentation can be rediscovered in perception, reality as well. I think this reads better if we say that something which is in the ego as representation can be rediscovered in perception. So the idea is, for example, some mashed potatoes that tasted really good, and so you have a representation, a memory of this food, and now you want to know if this is present in reality as well. So this is again a question of the internal and the external. This memory, this representation that you have in your psyche, whether you are able to refine this in the external world. On the one hand, we have what is merely subjective, internal, and imagined and real. My example also was the unicorn, versus what is objective, external, and real. Whether you have like a faithful memory of what happened, for example, a bike, and then you go to reality and you find the same bike. I don't want to get into the details of Freud's theory of the development of the psychic apparatus, but first, this is organized in terms of the pleasure principle. So just the fact that you are imagining something, it is as if it existed. So you basically can be hallucinating reality, thinking of something and you feel its existence. And then, so at this point, there's no antithesis between subjective and objective. And the development is where the pleasure principle is replaced by the reality principle. You start reality testing. You try to refine yourself to make sure that the object is still there. But if you're doing this, Freud says, because in the first place, you have lost the object, which once brought real satisfaction, right? So, of course, he's talking about the oral drive and the mother's breast. So this is the object, the paradigmatic object that once created satisfaction in the child. the object is lost, at least in the sense that it is not always present, that the child cannot control when the object is present or not. In this sense, it becomes an external object governed by the reality principle, and so you are trying to refine the object that corresponds to your representation, to your Vorstellung, rather than just imagining something, which is the most direct way of satisfying yourself. When you're fantasizing, when you are hallucinating, when you're dreaming, this is replaced by the reality principle, in which you have to do this detour in reality. You need to do whatever it takes to get to the object. Sometimes it's a lot of work to recreate your closeness with the object that you desire, to find the object in perception of the real, objective, external world. This is the reality principle. He connected the predicative judgment with this basic oral drive and the existential judgment with the transition from the pleasure principle to the reality principle. Freud talks about what he calls about the polarity of judgment. Today we would say judgment is binary, right? This is the law of the excluded middle. The judgment can be true or false. There's no third possibility. So there is a polarity. Only when we get to this point, we start understanding why Lacan wanted us at this point of the seminar to go back to Freud's text on negation. What's the relation with this text? Freud says at the end of this short article that there is a polarity of judgment, right? It's yes, it's there, or not, it's not there. It's true or false. So he relates this to two kinds of instincts. Again, I have to say this, the English translation says instinct. The German word is Trieb, which the consensus today is that this translates more as drive rather than instinct. So we are not placing this so much in the field of biology. So we have these drives. And one drive is the drive that is related to eros, to life, to everything that has to do with the libidinal. And what this erotic drive does is tries to unite, tries to connect, tries to assert, tries to affirm. And on the other pole of this polarity, we have negation. And negation, Freud says, is a successor to expulsion. It's whatever you are taking apart, differentiating, also destroying, killing, right, to the death drive. In the text, Freud says this negation is the successor to the drive of destruction, the destruction drive, okay? So bear this in mind. We have this polarity of judgment, and at the end of the article, Freud is making this connection to the erotic drive and to the destructive drive, the death drive. This was our excursion in Freud's text. Now let's go to Lacan's lecture for this day. At the end, this is like 10 pages. I want to skip it. I just did one slide to summarize this. He goes back to what we were discussing. You remember the relationship between resistance and transference, again talking about full speech with its base in the unconscious that tends to revelation, and then something happens that this free association is interrupted, and when it is interrupted, the subject, the patient, usually would be interested in something that has to do with the analyst, right? Some resistance will appear, and this resistance will include the person of the analyst. You're not interested in this. You will find this insulting. I noticed that you changed your curtain. And this is supported by the alienated form of being that one calls the ego. Again, just to refresh, to summarize what we were working on previous sessions, Lacan distinguishes between the subject and the ego. The subject has more to do with this free association, the work of the unconscious, and the ego is the alienated formation that identifies with the analyst, is alienated in the other, for example, in the image of the analyst, right? So he even calls the ego, or he even says that the fundamental function of the ego is misunderstanding. And in the English translation, they put the French word, in parentheses, méconnaissance. It's not just misunderstanding in the sense that we fail at understanding each other. It's like a basic confusion, a misrecognition. The ego is there to project, to separate, to dissociate, to identify, to this imaginary, alienated figure of the other person who is listening to me while I'm free associating. And so it's not working for analytic work, it's working for the resistance in this sense. And so this is just a summary of what we were already working on in our last meetings. In the middle of this class, there is a speech, a small presentation done by Jean Hippolyte. Jean Hippolyte was a French philosopher, a very important French philosopher, a Hegelian philosopher. He translated the phenomenology of spirit, like Hegel's most important work, into French. He had attended in previous years, I think it was 1936, 1939, I believe. They both attended together, Hippolyte and Lacan. They attended the seminar given by a very famous philosopher also called Alexander Koyev, who was talking about Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, with a special focus on a Marxist interpretation of the struggle between the slave and the master, right? The strife, the struggle between the slave and the master. This is usually referred to and as the master and slave dialectic. Hippolyte makes a presentation in the middle of Lacan's class about Freud's concept of negation. He makes a presentation about this article. This presentation is included in Seminar 1 at the end as an appendix, right? You can read it. It's not, I don't think it's fundamental. I don't think it really contributes a lot to this discussion. It's a philosophical analysis. Like, I only took 2 lines from this presentation. One is another German term, very important in Hegel's philosophy. It ends in ung, like many of these other terms, which is Aufhebung. And just to summarize here, it's a very technical term in Hegel's work. It means when you are suppressing something, but at the same time are maintaining what you eliminated and superseding it, all at the same time, these 3 movements at the same time. Another way of explaining what Aufhebung is to call it a negation of the negation. And this is what Hippolyte emphasizes here. What he says is that there is some kind of negation of the negation at play in the examples that Freud was giving us. For example, to say this that I am including here, I don't think that this should be part of my analysis. This is the movement of negation. I don't mean to be insulting, or I don't think that this person in the dream represents my mother. This is the first negation, and the second negation is when the analyst says, no, I don't think you should be negating that. I think actually it is your mother. The no is negated. It's a double negation. And that is why Jean Hippolyte makes the connection with double negation with Aufhebung. So there's still some repression when the patient is not accepting the meaning. And still, even after the analyst says, actually, I think the right interpretation is that this figure does represent your mom, still the client can intellectually accept it, but still not include this. And this might happen even in other interpretations, like you have this intellectual acceptance, but it doesn't touch the affective process. So repression in a way persists. The part where Lacan starts talking about Freud's text. And now this that appeared, why? I mean, we were talking about different topics. Why does he want us to read this article on negation? Now we're going to see the connection. Lacan says, well, this is a text that Freud published in 1925. This is after he had published this system of the ego, the superego, and the id. And what is interesting for me, says Lacan, is these 2 levels. So if you remember, we developed the whole article, the whole of Freud's article, but at the end of that article, Freud distinguishes a basic level of affirmation in this polarity of the judgment, right? What he calls this erotic drive of connecting, of affirming, of integrating. And the word Freud uses in German, I'm so sorry, one more word, is Bejahung. Now you can distinguish in Bejahung the yes, right? So this is an affirmation and of negativity. We were talking about the wolfman. You remember the scene that the wolfman dreamed about. He was in the bed, and through the window he was looking at these wolves, white wolves, looking at him on the branches of a tree, and this dream came with a huge terror, and Freud interprets this as the primal sin. This is a patient that when he was 1.5 years, probably saw his parents having sexual intercourse, and he was not able to process this. This scene was rejected, foreclosed, right? And then returns in the dream, in this image of the wolves. But something was not inscribed because the sexual component of what he saw, the sexual difference between the man and the woman, the man having the phallus, the woman being castrated, the man being in the active position, the woman being in the passive position. He assumes that the parents of the wolfman were having sex from behind the woman, right? So this was foreclosed. This was verworfen. Right? There was a Verwerfung at play. So Lacan says, literally, it has always been for him as if the genital plane did not exist. This is the Verwerfung, right? Literally, it has always been for him as if the genital plane, this plane, did not exist. We have been led to locate this rejection on the level, I would say, of the non-Bejahung, the non-affirmation, because we cannot in any way place it on the same level as the negation, Verneinung. So now you can start to see why Lacan picked this article, how this article by Freud on Verneinung connects to what we were working on about Verwerfung, because he's saying Verneinung happens if you're a neurotic, right? You have already repression is in place, there some content appears that you cannot tolerate, and you can repress it, Verdrängung, or you can accept it but deny it, and that would be Verneinung. This has nothing to do with me. I can see the content and then I negate that this content has something to do with me. But he's saying that what happens in the wolfman is like the most basic mechanism, the primary mechanism of Bejahung has not happened. So let me explain this to you, not in Lacan's terms, but in my words. And for me, the best example is to use the example of the child that we are spooning, we're starting to feed with a spoon, and for the first time, he can not accept the food. He's denying. This is not part of me, right? But for that negation to happen, a most basic affirmation needs to have happened before. This child was loved, some libido was invested in him, there was a place for him in the world. He got the support, the love, the nourishment from his parents. He felt wanted, desired, loved. There was a place for him or her in the world. There was a most basic Bejahung that was inscribed in him. And based on this basic Bejahung, based on this basic affirmation, because he or she is already something, then she or he can say, I don't want this food. So before the Verneinung, before the denial, a most basic affirmation, a most basic Bejahung needs to have happened. What Lacan is saying, Lacan is connecting the Verwerfung of the wolfman, the foreclosure of the wolfman, with Freud's article on the Verneinung, and saying what happened in the wolfman when he sees the primal scene, his parents having sex. It's not a negation, it's not a Verneinung, it's a non-affirmation, a non-Bejahung. Like something cannot be inscribed, cannot be integrated in his symbolic order. It's simply refused, foreclosed, rejected, thrown. There was no Bejahung for the wolfman, no realization of the genital plane. There is no trace of this plane in the symbolic register. The only trace we have of it is the emergence, not at all in his history, but really in the external world, of a minor hallucination. Because at some point, the wolfman hallucinates when he's a child that his finger has been cut. And he sees the finger just, only like united to the rest of his hand by like a tiny little bit of skin. And he sees the blood and he runs to his nanny to help him that his finger was cut. And this was all a hallucination. And we see the same mechanism. Something in castration as symbolic didn't work. So this is coming back in this kind of psychotic episode, this hallucination of his finger being cut. And this is why we have all this ambiguity and these doubts in Freud, that he labels the wolfman an obsessive neurotic, but we can see some episodes that are more characteristic of psychosis, like the hallucination of this finger being cut. So castration, which is precisely what didn't exist for him, manifests itself in the form of something he imagines, to have cut his little finger so deeply that it hangs solely by a little piece of skin. He is then overwhelmed by a feeling of a catastrophe that is so inexpressible that he doesn't even dare to talk of it to the person by his side. What is not recognized, what is Verwerfung, non-affirmation, non-Bejahung, erupts into consciousness in the form of the scene, of the imaginary. What didn't work in the level of the symbolic returns on the level of the imaginary.